Welcome to W Report. This is an analytical transformation of an interview. The Ukrainian side has its logic. The Russian position is also understandable, even the American strategy, trying to exit quietly, recover losses, and shift the burden onto Europe, seems coherent. But when it comes to the EU, their actions baffle everyone. Why are European leaders committing economic suicide over this proxy war? What price will Europe pay long term?
Well, I think that this was coming for a while. For as long as it's been clear that Russia would prevail in Ukraine, the economic and financial consequences for Europe and particularly for Great Britain were going to be quite grave. And what we know from, if you followed the news over the last 3 or 4 years, that the situation is deteriorating. It's coming on the back of not only the Project Ukraine, but also, we had the pandemic in 2020. Before that, we had the gradual introduction of these net zero policies. So, for example, in Germany, they started from the year 2000. They started phasing out the nuclear power plants, and they finished this on 15th April, I think, 2023 or 24, I forget. Very recently, they shut down their last nuclear power station, and then they also lost the Nord Stream pipelines, which were delivering large amounts of inexpensive, reliable supplies of natural gas from Russia for the German economy. How important was that? Well, in the words of one analyst, it was the cost of about $20 billion of Russian gas were powering the creation of $2 trillion of German final industrial products that they were then exporting to China, to the United States, and elsewhere. And now this is all in jeopardy. And I think that the ruling establishment was hoping that they would be able to prevail in Ukraine, which would make a number of things possible. It would, they would destabilize and regime change Russia, and then they would help themselves to Russian wealth and their assets. And the $300 billion worth of Russian frozen assets, they would have kept them. They would never have returned them. Now all of this is in jeopardy, and not only, but the money that they lent the Europeans, the money, hundreds of billions of dollars that they lent to Ukraine for the war and for defense, that would have been good debt. That those loans would be good assets. Now they're bad loans, and none of this is coming back. And what I think is even worse now, the thing that is practically a coup de grace to the Europeans, is that Trump, by reaching out to Vladimir Putin and them having a better relationship, one of the things that I think is very predictable is that the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets that are in the West, particularly in Europe, there's only about 5 to 8 billion in the United States. Everything else is practically in Europe. About 180 billion in Belgium under Euroclear. There's supposedly about $70 billion in France, about $37 billion in Britain. I think that one of the deals between Russians and the Americans is going to be that the Russians are going to invest this money in the United States. And, Donald Trump can always sweeten the deal and to say, okay, well, we'll unfreeze these assets if you invest it in the United States. We can relax some sanctions. We'll make everything better for you. And, in the same way that he has pitched the United States as an investment destination to the Saudi Arabia, to UAE and Qatar and so forth, he'll do the same for Russians. And for Russians, the move makes sense as well. And so this is going to be an additional piece of bad news for the Europeans, because the EU and Britain are in catastrophic fiscal positions. And they were counting on this money to repay some of their losses, to use that money as collateral to fuel a large new credit cycle in Europe, to create employment, maybe fund infrastructure investment, rearmament, and things like this. Now, if this money moves overseas, then I think Europe is coming to a dead end. And the likelihood of this happening, I think, is 100%. I think it's only a matter of time, and it's probably going to happen relatively soon. And so, if the Russians say, okay, we want to move these assets to the United States, the Europeans would normally be able to say, well, sorry, no, it's frozen and you're under sanctions. But if Trump says, free up those assets and send them over to New York, the Europeans are going to have to comply. And this has always been the case. This war has only revealed the extent to which the Europeans are in a subservient position to the United States. And this is not to do with Trump. If we think back to, when was it? I think it was 2011, maybe, when there was the big scramble to catch Edward Snowden, and he was in Moscow. And then the CIA suspected that he boarded President Evo Morales's aircraft to fly out and go to Bolivia. They ordered Italy, Spain, and Portugal to close down their airspace for Evo Morales's flight, and they forced his aircraft to land in Vienna, where they kept Evo Morales and the crew of his aircraft for 14 hours while they questioned them and searched the aircraft. This was completely illegal. It was a violation of international law. But the Europeans complied with the CIA request immediately, no questions asked. That is, they broke the international law to comply with hegemon's demand. And so, that's the nature of this relationship. And if Trump tomorrow says, turn over the Russian assets, the Europeans are going to have to do it. They have no choice.
Krainer says Europe bet everything and lost. They went all in on a proxy war, hoping for Russia's collapse and access to $300 billion in frozen assets. But now the ground is shifting. Trump could tell Putin, invest that money in the U.S. and we'll unfreeze it. And Russia might agree. Europe? Left with nothing. They no longer decide, they obey. Just like when the CIA ordered them to ground Evo Morales's plane. Sovereignty? An illusion? Economy? Sinking fast. Is the U.S. using Europe's collapse to boost its own economy by stealing industry, forcing energy deals, and making everyone pay back America?
Well, I always thought that the United States has a much more maneuvering space than other powers, other Western powers in this sense, and that they will be able to, let's say, manage the crisis, to engineer perhaps a soft landing. So, the debts are unpayable. There is going to be price inflation. There is going to be an economic crisis because, how do you repay $37 trillion worth of public debt? And that's just the public debt. If you take the total credit market debt, you come to something like $110 trillion. I don't know exactly what that is now, but I think it's north of $300,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. That's preposterous. That's just simply unpayable. So you are going to have a crisis of high inflation like we had in the 70s, or maybe worse. But the United States being a superpower, they can manage the situation in a much better way. They're sovereign. They have sovereign monetary policy. Trump can go around the world and get other nations to invest in the United States, as we discussed, and they will. The United States still has the world's dominant reserve currency and the trade settlement currency, which is the U.S. dollars. And so that gives them all kinds of ways to manage the crisis, whereas the same is not true of Japan or Britain or the EU. And so, while it's difficult to measure these things on, let's say, on the level of aggregates, because they're, the governments are publishing nonsense numbers, and you can't really believe anything. But if you look at simply at the trend of prices of sovereign bonds over the last few years, and this, the bond prices started to go into a bear market in the summer of 2021. So this pretty much coincided with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is when I thought that the empire sustained a fatal wound. You saw that the British, European, Japanese bonds started to go into a bear market, and American ones as well. But if you look 5 years later, the American bonds declined maybe 20% or so from the peak. I regret that I don't have the chart exactly in front of me, but I published the chart in one of my last articles on Substack. And you looked at the European bonds sustained a much, much bigger loss, and the British bonds even worse than that. And so it's telling you that the markets, over time have marked Great Britain and possibly Japan as the most vulnerable nations, as the first dominoes to fall, and that the confidence in the U.S. system, U.S. economy, and their debt is still the highest among the Western nations. So ever since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, I've always believed that the Great Britain is exactly the weak link in the Western world.
Have European leaders already looted parts of Russia's frozen assets? And if the U.S. walks away from Ukraine, what happens to Europe next?
Well, allegedly, they have only used the interest on those funds, which they, for some reason, think that they're entitled to, that's okay, but it's not. It's sketchy because obviously they're going to hide this. They're not going to, this is theft. This is theft, and this is, European governments basically vacating their own laws and creating terrible precedents because, any foreign entity, Brazil, China, India, Saudi Arabia, who might have assets in European banks, they're going to take note, and they're going to realize that these people are dishonest and that you cannot rely on them, and then they will not invest in Europe, right? But I think that you're right, because according to information that I have been able to find, about $71 billion worth of Russian frozen assets were supposed to be held in France. But now it appears that number is only 25 billion. So it's unclear how that figure went down from 70 to 25. But it's very likely that the Macron government decided to help themselves, which is why maybe explains why Macron has been so enthusiastic for this war and so panicked by the prospect of losing the war, because then they'll have to pay up, if the hostilities end, if the peace is concluded, and if the sanctions on Russia start to be lifted, then this money is going to have to be returned to Russia. And so then that's going to reveal that maybe Macron and his government have been taking advantage of this and stealing Russian assets. And how are they going to get them? They're losing their colonies. They have lost most of their colonies in Africa. There's nobody left to pillage and plunder. And the French people are, on the verge of some kind of a Bastille Day revolt. So you're not going to be able to procure that money by taxing the economy. The economy in France is already in a terrible state. So that might mean bankruptcy of the whole nation, and it might mean I don't know. I would say criminal proceedings, but at that stage, you don't get criminal proceedings so much as driving out the guillotines and pursuing the old French traditions of justice in that way. I don't know, but the situation is very drastic. Meanwhile, while you were asking me the question, I did pull up my the chart that I was mentioning about the government bonds, because I think that's quite a significant indication. So, looking from the 1st January of 2020, the American Treasury bonds have declined by about, let's say, 13%, and the Europeans by about 24%, and British bonds have declined by about 32%. So that's massive, massive difference between European and British bonds and the American bonds. And in particular, the British bonds look extremely volatile, extremely vulnerable, which tells you that the global markets have absolutely lost confidence in the British economy and the ability of the British government to service their debts.
Germany is shutting down its industry and being pushed to buy U.S. weapons. Is this the future? Deindustrialization in exchange for
I
militarization?
think that Europe has become a place that's at risk of being completely sidelined in world affairs, and I think that is in fact what is happening. I think that the 500 years of the Eurocentric global order has come to an end, and the center of gravity of global economic development, global finance, global trade, political power has shifted to the east. China, and in general in that region you have China, India, Japan, and then if this Bering Strait tunnel is dug up one day in the future, then the American continent then connects to this center of gravity. Whereas like if you look at the map of this from up north, kind of like from the North Pole perspective, then you see that suddenly the European continent finds itself completely on the periphery of this new center of gravity. And I think that's coming. And I unfortunately, the European leaders, I think that they became so complacent in this old post-World War II global order, where they could take for granted that the United States has their back, that they can do whatever they want because the Americans support them unconditionally, that they have not developed any economic, diplomatic, political strategies of their own, any kind of development path forward, any kind of security architecture that they could rely on independently without the help of the United States. That now the Trump administration has come in and they've decided to change course of the American foreign policy. They find themselves completely at loss. And the meeting that we had this week in Washington with Merz and Macron and von der Leyen and Meloni, sitting there across the table from Donald Trump, like like school children in principal's office. it was dismaying because, I tried to listen to um, to the footage of these meetings, and everything that the European leaders were saying was almost was very superficial. They were making these remarks as though they didn't really understand the issues at stake. You know, Ursula von der Leyen saying like, "Oh, we have to save the children because the children." I think she was trying to gain moral upper ground, pretend for the cameras that she has a heart. And then Friedrich Merz was saying some nonsensical things about this ceasefire, and nothing of substance, nothing that you would say like, "Oh, okay, these people understand the issues. They are aware of their negotiating positions. They are, you know, uh, drilling down to the relevant issues and trying to find a solution." No, they were just issuing platitudes to make themselves sound relevant and important, but without really touching on substance, without really taking responsibility for the situation that came about, and looking for their own role in the new world that's going to happen on the back of the whatever solution they had to propose. It was really truly sad. And so I think that almost the knee-jerk reaction is um, to deny the reality, denial. So I think that that's what came across. They are in denial of reality because the reality has them as completely superfluous players. And I think I'm not sure if this is a correct, if it's a confirmed piece of news, but Donald Trump even asked Ursula von der Leyen to leave the room when he was discussing certain things with the elected leaders of the European powers, and that just tells you how contemptible their position now is. And I think it's largely thanks to them thoughtlessly, complacently following the policies of the financial centers like Wall Street and the City of London, and having no thought of their own, what their countries needed, what their people needed, how to resolve the real issues of war and peace, security architecture, economic development, social development, and so forth.
Europe hides behind moral language, human rights, climate, democracy. But is this just a way to avoid real strategic decisions while the continent collapses economically and geopolitically?
Yeah, well, I think the Europeans became so common, also used to speaking about all issues, all politics in this moral framing. I mean, when von der Leyen comes in, middle of this negotiations for peace, and what also then implies the future of the European security architecture, and she says, "Well, we have to get the children." All I think that Trump would hear is she's trying to pit the Americans against the Russians and make them walk back some of the agreements because, well, from my perspective, Europe has become very dependent on moral framing. I think a lot of countries do it, but the Europeans, they do it to a large extent. I mean, whenever you frame any issue in the language of morality, you don't have opposition anymore. That is, and we see this across Europe. If you discuss immigration, there's one thing you're allowed to say because it's moral, and the other one is, you're a racist or you're horrible. You can't take that position. Same as environment. Either you support the pouring money into this or you're a climate change denier. The gender issue, either you accept them or you're a bigot. And the same applies often in foreign policy. That is, we have this, all our foreign policies, all our wars, everything is, but in human rights, but their democracy, freedom, as if this is what drives the foreign policy of countries. My favorite is possibly the idea that, well, NATO, we had 20 years of occupation was not enough in Afghanistan because we have to let the young girls go to school. I mean, this is, it's just so stupid that this is really why we devoted all this money, all these lives, all this 2 decades of occupation. But anyways, it's a way of, I think the Europeans are especially addicted to it, because if you're going to have like 28 or is it 27 member states in the European Union, all with different interests, identities, background, geographies, the idea that the Italians and the Estonians should have the same interest, I mean, it's ludicrous. So I think framing everything as morality is a way to get everyone on the same page, a form of rhetorical entrapment. So I think this is common in Europe. So if you don't want if you don't want to have these negotiations with the Russians, you don't want to take NATO expansion off the table, you don't sit down and have a serious discussion about security architecture, mutual threats. No, you talk about the children, as you said, even if she would care about a lot of these issues, from what I hear, are somewhat inflated. But again, as these are framed in morality, I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say. But do the Europeans, do you see these European leaders, they surely must know, I mean, behind this speech acts they're using to frame everything in the lens of morality, surely they must see the severity, what is happening now, the economic disaster is pending, the geopolitical crack, if they bet everything on the United States being still their daddy, and even alienating the Chinese, the Russians, everyone. And now the Americans want to leave more than anything, and this deal with the Russians is how they're going to achieve it. I mean, they must see this, right? Because this is going to be the worst thing that happened to Europe in centuries.
Europe got involved in a proxy war hoping to weaken Russia and profit, but it's losing economically. It lost access to cheap resources, is deindustrializing, and accumulating debt. The United States is turning the crisis to its advantage, absorbing European industry, pushing trade deals, and preparing to return frozen Russian assets in exchange for investments. The EU has already spent part of these funds and risks, ending up with nothing. European leaders hide behind moral rhetoric, but are actually losing influence and control. The Union is weakening, with the risk of collapse and social upheaval ahead. Thanks for watching. Support the channel if you find this format valuable. More deep dives are coming soon. Until then, think for yourself and draw your own conclusions.